are Locked On Seahawks, your daily Seattle Seahawks podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Greetings, 12s. This is Corbin Smith, your host for Locked On Seahawks. Joining me as always, my co-host in crime, Rob Rang. A little different Tuesday episode coming your way, 12s. Normally, we'd be looking at our upcoming opponent, doing some Throwback Tuesday, breaking down what's new, departures, additions, draft picks. But the only opponent the Seahawks have this week is extra time. So we're not going to be diving into that opponent, and the depth chart for time is not necessarily the most exciting thing. So we are going to be looking at midseason awards over the next couple of days. Going to start on offense today. And, of course, we're going to be checking out what happened, or in this case, what didn't happen before today's trade deadline. Thanks for making Locked On Seahawks your first listen every day. We are free and available on all platforms. Now for your lead story here on Locked On Seahawks. The 4 p.m. Eastern Time trade deadline has passed. It's gone. It's in the rearview mirror. And not surprisingly, the Seahawks did not make a single move. This is something that you and I both had anticipated going into this. John Schneider said before the game on Sunday that it was pretty quiet on the trade front. Of course, you can never say never with John Schneider. He traded for Dunlap last year, Quandre the year before. But it just felt like going into this trade deadline, the Seahawks obviously in a much different position from a record standpoint, the way things have played out so far. It just didn't set up favorably for this to be a deadline where they were going to be very active, if active at all. And that turned out to be the case. No trades of players out, no acquiring players to bring in, no swapping draft picks, absolutely no activity. So they chose to just sit pat, and a lot of other teams followed suit. Not a lot of activity, even by NFL trade deadline standards.
Yeah, there wasn't a lot of activity. There was some. I'm just going to acknowledge the four trades that did happen throughout the league today. And so the Broncos traded the cornerback Kerry Vincent to the Eagles for a 2022 sixth-round pick. The Kansas City Chiefs traded their guard Laurent Duvernay-Tardif to the Jets for tight end Dan Brown. The 49ers, which is notable because, of course, the Rams made a big trade also in the division, but the 49ers acquired Charles Omenihu, an edge rusher, defensive end, from the Texans in exchange for 2023 sixth-round draft pick from the Texans. And then the Chiefs acquired Melvin Ingram from the Steelers in exchange for a 2022 sixth-round draft pick. But still, we are talking about late round draft picks for veteran players, Corbin, who basically are either players that are at the back end of your roster or very much, at least in the case of, say, a Melvin Ingram, very much in the downside of their careers. As we talked about, we weren't expecting the Seahawks to be very active in this trade market, just because of the fact that they do have that 3-5 record, that they do have plenty of optimism of why they might be able to have a big rebound in the second half of the season. And yet at the same time, they also were limited with the draft process or the draft picks if they could trade away. And they didn't want to, acquire a whole bunch more salary. So I think that this was as expected, that there were some relatively minor moves made throughout the NFL, a couple of moves made in the NFC West. We talked about the big one in the NFC West during yesterday's show with the Los Angeles Rams making the trade for Von Miller. But the Seahawks wound up standing pat, and the players that some Seahawks fans out there were basically clamoring for Seattle to try to trade away, Rashad Penny, LJ Collier among them, the Seahawks probably just weren't able to find any type of suitors, just because of the fact that when they don't see any kind of playing time, when they aren't very productive, it's going to be very difficult to expect much from return from players that have struggled so far in their NFL careers.
Yeah, Penny and Collier, the two former first-rounders, they've been the ones that fans have been clamoring for the Seahawks to try to trade them. But you have to have a trade partner to make a trade work. And from my understanding, Penny, they hadn't even tried to move him. We know with the injuries he's had, the fact he has not played well the first two games coming back, there weren't going to be any teams out there willing to give up draft capital to bring him in. And there's a number of teams that could use some running back help, but they weren't going to trade any draft picks for him, given his durability issues and his lack of production. And LJ Collier, he's the one that I've been told 3-4 weeks ago that they were trying to move, and that's not surprising. He's been a healthy scratch now in 6 of their 8 games. He's clearly fallen out of favor with the coaching staff. He was passed by Robert Kimdichie on the depth chart. When he has played, hasn't had a lot of opportunities, limited snaps. He's really frustrated about the situation. And Pete Carroll said we wanted to be bigger in the interior. And he's also insinuated other players just simply have earned those snaps, and he is not. And so it seemed like those two were heading towards a split. But the problem is you can't expect to trade a player. I don't care if he was a first-round pick a few years ago. He hasn't played up to that level. You can't expect another team to send draft picks to acquire a player like that when you are showing everyone we don't believe in this guy. We're not playing him. We're not even activating him to be dressing for games 75% of the time. You can't expect anybody is going to suddenly be like, you know what, I'll give you a 5th-round pick for LJ Collier. Yeah, he's young. Yeah, he's got versatility, can play multiple spots, had a decent 2020 season, but 6 out of 8 games, healthy scratch. I mean, all that is screaming to teams is this guy doesn't have it. So why would somebody else want to trade for him? And so that's been a bit of a mystifying process. Aside from that, as far as I know, the Seahawks weren't really active trying to shop any other players on their team. They have limited draft capital to begin with. They don't have a ton of players that were going to be available to trade because they still do believe they can make a second-half run. And those Carlos Dunlap, Quandre Diggs type deals just simply weren't out there for them. Not as much activity this year in the trade deadline in general as what there has been the last couple of years. And it's not like the NFL trade deadline is usually overly exciting anyway. There's not a ton of activity compared to other major sports like the NBA and Major League Baseball, where they can basically make a holiday out of it. The NFL, it could, skip and people aren't even going to notice for the most part because there's not much activity. But ultimately, the Seahawks decided, look, we're 3-5. We believe we can make a run in the second half with the players we have. We're not going to force the issue. John Schneider made some calls around as he always does. He couldn't move LJ Collier. They weren't trying to move anyone else. They like the team they've got, and they're getting Russell Wilson, potentially Chris Carson, and D. Eskridge back in the near future. So basically, there's your trade deadline additions. They're coming off of injured reserve to bolster your offense, and that's the way that they're looking at this now. Hence why they decided, you know what, we're not going to flip a 6th or 7th rounder to get a mediocre player that might be able to help us a little bit. The deals just weren't out there, and it didn't make much sense for them. So none of this surprised me.
No, I 100% agree with you. And if you're the Seahawks, can you imagine the public relations hit if you trade a 1st-round pick from a couple of years ago, whether it be Penny, whether it be Collier, and you wind up only getting a 6th or 7th round selection for them? Because let's be real, that's the likely compensation that the Seahawks would have received at best. And so I just don't think that you are going to be willing to do that. Not for guys who are 25, 26 years old, making relatively little money. Look, Rashad Penny has been a disappointment. LJ Collier has been a disappointment. But at the same time, they just simply have better players ahead of them for the Seahawks. There's a lot of teams out there that could use a Rashad Penny. The Tennessee Titans, unfortunately for them, just lost one of the absolute best players in all of the NFL with Derrick Henry to what it looks like to be a season-ending injury, and they're bringing back Adrian Peterson. There's no question in my mind that Rashad Penny absolutely could have helped the Tennessee Titans, but at the same time, why would they make that trade? Why would the Seahawks make that trade? Seattle is fortunate that they have the depth that they have at the running back position. As you just mentioned, the Seahawks are hopeful that Chris Carson is going to come back. Alex Collins has been absolutely a dynamic player for Seattle, and as has DJ Dallas and Travis Homer and their limited opportunities as well. I thought that there was a possibility that Seattle might look to trade Rashad Penny. I thought that was one of the reasons why that he has had pretty extensive opportunities here for the last couple of weeks. But at the same time, it would be a hard pill to swallow to get such a late round pick for a guy who has the talent that Rashad Penny has, that has the talent that LJ Collier has. I think instead, keep those players on the roster, see if you can light a fire under them, because again, this is going to be a season of attrition. There's going to be injuries that happen. I am not convinced that LJ Collier and Rashad Penny are not going to get an opportunity to make a big play down the stretch for the Seahawks. I'd rather it be here in Seattle rather than for some other club.
Well, I think that was Seattle's viewpoint based on the sources that I talked to. We're not going to flip LJ Collier for a conditional 7th round pick because if we have one injury at defensive tackle or defensive end, we could badly use him. I mean, he's one injury away from being right back in the rotation and playing every week. And so they want to keep him around unless they were blown away with an offer. Like, I think if they would have been offered a 5th rounder, I think they would have considered it just because he hasn't been playing. He's clearly fallen out of favor in the rotation. But just think about this. Melvin Ingram, he might be on the tail end of his career, but he's still a really solid pass rusher. The Steelers can only get a 6th round pick for him. That tells you what the market was like. There are a ton of teams that still believe they are in the playoff hunt, especially in the NFC, and we'll get to that in the second quarter. But I think that had a lot to do with the fact that this was a really quiet deadline as well. Speaking of the NFC playoff race, when we come back in the second quarter, Rob and I are going to be revisiting the standings of the Seahawks head into their bye week, and they're only one game out of a wild card spot, despite the way things unfolded the first 8 games of the season. We're going to look at some reasons why fans should be optimistic about Seattle's chances of making a run and why maybe they shouldn't be so optimistic. When we come back, you're listening to the Locked On Seahawks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Hey, Seahawks fans, this is Corbin Smith with an incredible app everyone who buys gas needs to know about. It's called Get Upside. My listeners are making up to 25 cents for every gallon of gas every time they fill up. Just download the free Get Upside app in the App Store or Google Play right now and use the promo code Touchdown. You'll get a bonus 25 cents per gallon on your first fill up. That's up to 50 cents cash back. Don't pay full price at the pump anymore. Get cash back using Get Upside. Just download the app for free and use the promo code Touchdown to get up to 50 cents per gallon cash back on your first tank. Some people who drive a lot are making as much as $200 to $300 a month in cash back, and there's no catch. The cash back gets added right to your account. You can cash out anytime with your bank account, PayPal, or an e-gift card from places such as Amazon and other brands. Just download the free Get Upside app and use the promo code Touchdown to get up to 50 cents per gallon cash back on your first tank. Welcome back to the Locked On Seahawks podcast. Glad to have you listening in for our Tuesday episode. I'm your host, Corbin Smith. Joining me as always, Rob Rang. The Seahawks entering their bye week at 3-5. They're still in last place in the NFC West, but they're coming off the big win against the Jaguars on Sunday. They've got Russell Wilson getting close to returning. Chris Carson, they're believing, is close to returning. D. Eskridge is expected to practice next week after a long stay on the injured reserve with a concussion. So they could have all three of those players back for the Green Bay game, and maybe the next week they'll have all three of them on the field together. Timelines still remain to be figured out, but there's a lot of reason for optimism. And we know Pete Carroll, he's as optimistic as any head coach in the NFL, and even he's been tested and tried here in this first half of the season with the way that the team has struggled. But he was certainly excited talking to reporters yesterday about where Seattle's at, despite how things have played out to this point, because he's getting a star quarterback back, potentially getting a starting running back back. They like the way they've played the last 3 weeks. Even though they lost 2 of those games, they've been very competitive, even without Russell Wilson. So, Rob, it just feels like when you look at the standings in the NFC, it really feels like, despite how everything has went down, the Seahawks are one game out of a playoff spot. Right now, the Carolina Panthers at 4-4 with a reeling Sam Darnold. He's been benched recently. They have the number 7 spot, the last wild card behind them. The Minnesota Vikings, yes, Seattle lost the tiebreaker to them by losing to them in week 3, but they just lost their best player on defense. Danielle Hunter is out for the season. The 49ers behind them, Seattle's already beaten them, and they've had their share of struggles. The Falcons at 3-4, nobody's looking at them as a contender. Philadelphia, same thing. The other teams that are at 3-5, Chicago, Justin Fields has had his issues. They've got coaching problems. Maybe Matt Nagy doesn't even make it out of the season. So it feels like of that group of teams behind Carolina, from a talent standpoint, the Seahawks clearly are the most talented team of that bunch.
They absolutely are. And that's why there is plenty of reason to feel optimistic about the fact that Seattle is still making the playoffs. Now, Corbin, you and I have talked about this over and over again. I think that the division title is likely in the rearview mirror. There's no chance you're going to be able to compete with that. The Arizona Cardinals and Los Angeles Rams have really just stepped to the forefront of the division. But yeah, with there being an additional wild card team that is available after this 17-game season, with the fact that Seattle is pretty healthy when you look at the rest of the teams throughout the league, as you just mentioned, the Minnesota Vikings losing Danielle Hunter, the San Francisco 49ers basically playing quarterback roulette with Jimmy Garoppolo and Trey Lance. Calvin Ridley, the best wide receiver, at least, for the Atlanta Falcons, basically taking some time away from the from football due to mental health concerns for himself. I think that deserves some respect, but at the same time, it obviously impacts the Atlanta Falcons. You mentioned Carolina Panthers, and I would lump in the Philadelphia Eagles there with Sam Darnold, obviously with Carolina, Jalen Hurts, obviously with Philadelphia. I really thought those are two teams that might be willing to make a big splashy trade to go get Deshaun Watson. Obviously, that did not happen. And so I think the Carolina Panthers right now are struggling, and Philadelphia Eagles are struggling as well. Those are two teams I think are falling apart a little bit, whereas the Seahawks, I think that there is plenty of reason for optimism. And so I would agree with you that I think Seattle, as long as they can get on a little bit of a run, which we've talked about before, historically, the Seahawks have improved in the second half of the season, especially on the defensive side of the ball. We saw evidence of that the last 3 weeks now in a row. And then the fact that Seattle is certainly going to be getting Russell Wilson back soon, possibly is going to be getting Chris Carson and D. Eskridge, two guys who I think dramatically change their offense. And oh, by the way, there's a really interesting guy from the Los Angeles Rams, Deshaun Jackson, who I think that Pete Carroll has always wanted to have on his roster going back to his Pac-12 days. I would not be surprised at all if Seattle does make a little bit of run in the second half and certainly makes this a much more interesting second half of the season for the Seahawks.
This is a very top-heavy conference. When you look at the top, Green Bay 7-1, Arizona 7-1, Dallas is 6-1, Tampa Bay 6-2, the Rams at 7-1, the Saints at 5-2. They have the tiebreaker on the Seahawks, but they just lost Jameis Winston for the season. And so they're in a position where Trevor Siemian or maybe even Phillip Rivers is going to be quarterbacking them. I don't know how much that rumor has teeth to it, but apparently he has said I'd be willing to listen if they called me. So we don't know what's going to play out there. But the injuries that have hit New Orleans and Minnesota and Carolina, several of these teams, Philadelphia's had some players go down. It's set up favorably with the Seahawks having the opposite, where Russell Wilson, Chris Carson, and D. Eskridge are coming back here in the next week or two. That is setting up opposite for Seattle. They're getting healthier. Their defense has been playing much better. And I think that's probably the reason that I am most optimistic about where this team is at right now. Because if they were winning games recently and the defense was still struggling, first off, I would have been just extremely surprised because that would have meant Geno Smith and the offense were just lighting it up. But if they would have been struggling defensively throughout those 3 games, then I wouldn't have felt confident about this group having any chance to really right the ship. But they have been playing well for close to a month. They're getting the job done. They've been outstanding in the red zone, one of the best red zone defenses in the league. They've got Quandre Diggs in center field. The pass rush is starting to find some life the past couple games. So that is, to me, the biggest reason to be optimistic. You look at the schedule, the way it's set up. You've got games against the Texans, the Bears, the Lions. Those last 2 games are at home. You just won your first home game. You're hoping you don't lose another home game the rest of the season after losing your first 3. They've also got a home game against San Francisco, who they've already beaten. That'll be a tough game, but that is a game that's definitely winnable for them. They have a number of winnable games. Washington as well. They've been disappointing this year. That's a road game, will be tough, but those are all winnable games for the Seahawks, and this is a top-heavy conference. I could see a 9-8 team getting that number 7 seed with the way things are playing out right now. Not that Seattle is going to be that. They could get to 10 wins. It's going to be difficult for them to do that, but they certainly could. Those are the reasons for optimism, but I think we also have to look at this from a reality standpoint and also know that aside from those 5 really winnable games, Seattle's also got 4 brutal games left in their schedule, starting with Week 10 at Lambeau Field, where, by the way, they have not won since 1999.
Yeah, if we want to be negative, there's plenty of reasons to be negative. I'm going to finish up with one more positive thought. That is the idea that the pin out and that right hand pin out means win out. I mean, to me, it is not inconceivable that Seattle gets on a little bit of a run here. I mean, the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, of course, are the reigning Super Bowl champions, and they got in to the playoffs last year as a wild card team. So that's the thing, is that you can get hot. That's one of the fun things about the NFL. It's not who necessarily is the most talented team. It's who's hot at the end. And if Seattle can get into the playoff hunt at the very, very end, they would have to be one of the hottest teams because obviously they have some work to do. But yes, let's just kind of focus in on the negative ideas and why this could not happen, why this is unrealistic. And to me, the absolute easiest way of just doing that is just looking at the 3 teams that Seattle has beaten so far. The Indianapolis Colts in the opener. It was a hard-fought victory, and the Indianapolis Colts have looked like most of the Carson Wentz teams over the last couple of years. Obviously, he struggled in Philadelphia. That's why he got traded to Indianapolis, and he's just made some horrific mistakes. The Colts do not look like a very good football team right now. The Jacksonville Jaguars might just be the worst team in all of the NFL, so it should be expected that Seattle was able to get that victory, as impressive as it was. And then, as you just mentioned with the San Francisco 49ers, that's a team, again, who has had some impressive, moments of play, but at the same time, it's very difficult to have any type of sustained success when you've had the durability issues that San Francisco has had, and then you're having the quarterback rotation that they've had as well. So to me, if you want to be negative, if you want to be pessimistic about where the Seattle is at this point, then I think it's really easy to focus in on the fact that the 3 teams that they have actually earned victories against have been arguably 3 of the 5 or 6 worst teams in all of the NFL.
That is definitely a reason to pause because you look at the wins they've got, they're not against impressive teams. Now, they had the Rams on the ropes for a little bit in that game before Russell Wilson got hurt, and Geno Smith almost carried them back. And so they've been competitive against quality teams. They had the Titans beat, and then they choked it away in the fourth quarter. So you can look at it from both sides of the equation. I think the biggest reason why I would be down on their chances of getting back to the playoffs is because of the fact that they've got 2 games left against Arizona. They have a game left against the Rams on the road. They got to play Green Bay on the road. They've got some brutal games on their schedule remaining. If you lose 3 or all 4 of those games, you're not making the playoffs. So they're going to have to find a way to steal a few of those games, and they have to win all the games they're expected to win, which they haven't necessarily done that in the first half of the season. So I can see reasons on both sides of the coin, and that's what's going to make this a lot of fun when the Seahawks get back to practice next week is they really do control their destiny. You just need to go out 1 week at a time, and you need to take care of your business. You need to win games. And if they're able to do that, Russell Wilson and the offense is able to have more complete games. They weren't doing that with him under center the first 5 weeks. If they can do that, Shane Waldron gets things firing. They get D. Eskridge involved. He stays on the field. The defense keeps showing improvements, making strides. Then this team can still be a dangerous team that gets into the playoffs, and nobody wants to play them in January. But there are a lot of ifs there, and that's why you don't want to start the season 2-5 or 3-5 because you've dug yourself a hole that's really hard to get out of. There have been 19 teams that have started 3-5 and made the playoffs, and almost half of those have been since 2012. So recently, there have been several teams that have been able to do this. Maybe the Seahawks can become the 20th team in 2021 to accomplish that feat. We come back in the third quarter. We're at the midway point. I guess you could say technically 17-game schedules kind of muddied things up a little bit, but Seahawks going into their bye week. Rob and I are going to dish out our midseason awards on the offensive side of the football. You won't want to miss it. You're listening to the Locked On Seahawks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
In life, we're all bound for different things. With beachbound.com vacations, you could be bound for adventure, bound for passion, bound for discovery, or bound for togetherness, bound for immersion, bound for rejuvenation, or you may be bound for encountering the unexpected. Personally, when I'm at a beach resort, I'm bound to end up at the poolside bar or maybe create my own taco fight. As long as I've got a good view a good fishing pole in the water, and a good drink in my hand, I'll be as happy as can be. With beachbound.com, you can find the perfect beach vacation for you. No matter what you're looking for, what are you bound for? Visit beachbound.com today.
Welcome back to the Locked On Seahawks podcast, Tuesday edition. I'm your host, Corbin Smith, joined by Rob Rang. Pete Carroll was laughing about this yesterday, Rob. Somebody asked him, how weird is this for you trying to split up the season with that 17th game added? Because I can tell you most football coaches are not mathematicians, and it was always so easy with a 16-game schedule. You've got your first 4 games, second 4 games. I can split into even quarters. I can split the season in half, first 8 games, last 8 games. Well, 17 games, you can't do that. And so Pete Carroll said, I just decided with our bye being in the middle of the season that this is our midway point. So with us reaching that point, 8 games down, 9 games left to play in this expanded 2021 schedule, it's time to hand out some midseason hardware. We're going to start on offense. We've got a number of awards. One that we will not be covering because the Seahawks had no draft picks this year and no rookies have really been playing. We won't be doing a rookie of the year because it would have been given to Jake Curran by default just because he's played in more than 1 game. So we aren't going to have that award, but we have a number of other awards that we will be handing out hardware for. And of course, we got to start with our first one here, offensive MVP. I actually briefly thought about, guys that have played in every single game so far, but that would just be slighting Russell Wilson. We've seen what life is like. And no offense to Geno Smith, he's done some great things. He's played admirably. He's not Russell Wilson, though. We truly have gotten to see the last 3 weeks just how valuable number 3 is. So he's undoubtedly the most valuable offensive player on this football team.
Yeah, I think that it's just proven his value to the squad. And I think that's one of the things that it's actually kind of important to look at that from a holistic perspective. All throughout the NFL, it always makes me laugh when we see these MVP, awards and things like that. Who truly is the most valuable player? I would argue that Russell Wilson has been an MVP player, despite the fact that he's never gotten an actual official vote for the NFL. In the NFL media in his entire career. I think this is just demonstrating how valuable he is to the Seattle Seahawks. Very similarly, how valuable, say, Aaron Rodgers might be for the Green Bay Packers. I think it's going to be fascinating to see how valuable Derrick Henry is going to be for the Tennessee Titans with him going down to injury. So, yeah, I think that addition by subtraction or subtraction by addition, I guess you could say, that with Russell Wilson being out, we have seen the Seahawks come close to some victories, and obviously they beat the Jacksonville Jaguars. I think also that there's a lot of people out there who also would believe that the Seahawks would have beat the New Orleans Saints, would have beaten the Pittsburgh Steelers if number 3 had been on the field. So, yeah, no question about it in my mind. The offensive MVP has to be number 3.
10 touchdowns, just 1 interception. He's still the league leader in yards per attempt and passer rating among qualified passers. So he's had another outstanding year. They're really looking forward to getting him back, hoping it's going to be in 2 weeks in Green Bay. Now, best offensive player, we're going to make this a non-QB award. Aside from Russell Wilson, who is your pick for the best offensive player on the Seahawks in the first 8 games? There were a couple that I considered for this one.
Yeah, I think that you have to give a tip of the cap to the running back, Alex Collins. I think that he has been absolutely spectacular at times this season. To me, the best player, though, is the most physically gifted player on Seattle's entire roster, in my opinion, that being DK Metcalf. I'm going to talk about this a little bit later when we discuss the top play so far from the Seahawks, at least on the offensive side of the ball. But DK Metcalf, to me, is their best player, and it is one of the reasons why Seahawks fans should be optimistic that the present is bright, the future is even brighter.
Yeah, I picked Metcalf as well. I thought about Tyler Lockett because when you look at the stats, they only have 1 yard separating them for receiving yards and only 2 receptions. They're almost identical statistically after 8 games. The difference has been DK Metcalf has scored 8 touchdowns and Tyler Lockett has only scored 3. Metcalf also has more than 50 yards after the catch that he's created compared to Lockett, and he's got around 15 yards per reception. Tyler Lockett's at 14.1. So it was little things like that that ultimately swayed me towards Metcalf because I agree with you. I think he has been, from a consistency standpoint, when we're talking about being spectacular, he has been the best player for the Seattle Seahawks on either side of the football. Best offensive lineman, this one was actually kind of tough because I feel like every lineman has kind of had a roller coaster season to this point. We haven't seen anybody really go out and just be dominant. They certainly haven't had a Pro Bowl caliber player up front, though I do think they have one player that is trending in that direction. When you look at the last 3 games, Gabe Jackson came to Seattle from the Raiders with a reputation for being a really good pass protector. 1 pressure allowed in the last 3 games. Kind of got off to a rough start in that regard. Run blocking has been inconsistent for him for much of his career. That has continued this year. Feels like he's a lot better when they're running gap concepts than the zone stuff. So maybe they need to switch up the way that schematically they're attacking teams. But Gabe Jackson's my lineman of the year. To me, it wasn't really close because of how dominant he's been in pass protection in front of Geno Smith the last 3 games.
Yeah, for so long, we've just been saying Dwayne Brown without even thinking about it. He'd playing at such a Pro Bowl level, but unfortunately, there has been some struggles this year. And I really thought strongly about Damian Lewis. I thought that, kind of similar to the fact that Russell Wilson went down and we saw what a drop off there. Damian Lewis to me is a good young football player, but I do have to kind of give a tip of the cap to Gabe Jackson here. I think that he has been Seattle's most consistent offensive lineman, not only in pass protection, but also in the running game. And that's not necessarily saying that much because I think Seattle's offensive line has struggled at times. But to me, Gabe Jackson has been exactly what John Schneider and the Seahawks hoped that he would be, a solidifying force along the offensive line.
Now looking at most improved, this was one I actually had some issue with, and maybe this is something that Seahawks fans can consider and be like, that's a little worrisome. But I actually had a hard time with this because for the most part, players have either met expectations on offense or they have come up short. There were a lot more players that I considered being disappointments than most improved. But to me, there's one player that you can put here that's already passed his receptions and receiving yards from his rookie season. He's tied his touchdown mark. Not gaudy numbers by any means, but Freddie Swain has been much more involved, especially with D. Eskridge being out with a concussion. And he's had a 68-yard touchdown, albeit against broken coverage against the Titans earlier this year. So it feels like he has taken a pretty significant step forward. He's been involved in the run game. He's their punt returners, had a couple nice punt returns so far this year. So there's not a lot of options here, but it does feel like Freddie Swain has made some strides in his sophomore season.
No, I think he has made some strides. I'm actually going to go back to Alex Collins here for a moment. And again, I want to mention, another player who I think has definitely improved, and that being Kyle Fuller. But at the same time, maybe even after a month of the season, I would have absolutely emphatically said that it's been Kyle Fuller. But the struggles with communication to me has been a huge part of that. And obviously the fact that Ethan Posick has reclaimed that starting position is a sign that the Seahawks do not feel the same way. So I think that Freddie Swain deserves some credit. But to me, Alex Collins, just because I thought that he was at best going to be Seattle's number 4 running back on this squad. And instead, with the durability issues of Chris Carson, with the fact that DJ Dallas and Travis Homer have made some splashy plays at times, to me, Alex Collins has been arguably Seattle's most consistent player so far. So I think that he certainly deserves some type of acknowledgement. And I'll give him this acknowledgement here with most improved, just because he has proven to be Seattle's bell cow when they've called upon him.
And I also think Travis Homer might have been an interesting candidate there, even though his stats aren't gaudy. He hasn't had a lot of opportunities. He's done some nice things, especially considering that expectations weren't very high going into the year. You and I both thought there was a chance he might get cut because of the backfield depth. And here he is making big plays for him on offense and special teams. Top newcomer, I'm going to say Jackson on this one because it's either between him or Gerald Everett. And I just feel like Everett has not been consistent. I don't necessarily think it's his fault. He missed 2 games on the COVID list. I don't feel like Shane Waldron's done near as good of a job getting the tight ends involved in the passing game as I hoped and expected he would during the early portion of this season. Maybe that turns around in the second half. We've seen splash plays from Everett, but Jackson's been the one constant in that offensive line, at least in pass protection, and he's been well worth the investment they made, giving up a 5th-round pick and extending him through the 2023 season. So Jackson's my pick, top newcomer.
Yeah, I think I probably should agree with you here on that. I think that Gabe Jackson has been Seattle's top newcomer. I really want to give this award to Gerald Everett because I 100% agree with you in that I just don't think the Seahawks are using Gerald Everett enough. We see the occasional little fly sweep kind of action, and it just feels like every NFL team knows that that's something that Shane Waldron and the Rams did with Gerald Everett before. You just see some of the flashes of what Gerald Everett can do. And his size, his speed, his tackle breaking ability. So I am going to go with Gerald Everett. I just am doing that based on what I think that Gerald Everett can become, but unfortunately has not yet become for the Seahawks.
Now looking at biggest surprise, there have been some surprises on the offensive side of the football. Unfortunately for me, a lot of them have been in the negative direction. They've been negative surprises. But if you're looking for positive ones, to me, this is pretty easy. I mean, Geno Smith had not started a game since 2017. And yes, he has started quite a few games compared to most backups in the league. He's struggled with the New York Jets. We know that he's got a big arm. We know he's got athleticism. He wasn't able to put things together, though, with the first 2 or 3 teams that he played on. So really nobody knew what to expect. We've never seen a life without Russell Wilson. And yes, they lost his first 2 starts. Yes, he made some critical errors down the stretch in both those games that prevented them from winning. But to see him go out there, he has 5 touchdowns, 1 interception, passer rating above 100. He's completed 68% of his passes. His teammates respect him. They're playing hard for him. They wanted to help him get that first win as a starter since 2014. He has exceeded my expectations in every way, especially Sunday. I don't care if it's the Jacksonville Jaguars. Some of the throws he was completing were ridiculous. They were challenging, but he was putting touch on the ball, great anticipation. And so he's really exceeded my expectations. Going out and completing his first 14 passes the other day, to me, he has been the biggest surprise.
Yeah, I think that he deserves a lot of credit. I'm going to go with the rookie side, just because we did eliminate the rookie of the year for Seattle on the offensive side of the ball. Because of course, D. Eskridge hasn't had many opportunities, but the undrafted free agent Jake Curran making this roster in the first place, being able to play some fairly meaningful snaps, I thought played pretty well. I think that he deserves some biggest surprise acknowledgement. But I'll also go that negative route. One of my shockers this year is the fact that Colby Parkinson has apparently not, basically even on Seattle's roster the way that they're playing. I really thought that Colby Parkinson was going to be a breakout candidate for the Seahawks. Instead, he's been a forgotten candidate on the Seahawks so far. So to me, one of the biggest surprise, unfortunately, has been the lack of Colby Parkinson making big plays for this team.
And last but not least, the top offensive play of the first half of the season. I was torn on a couple of them. A few DK Metcalf plays obviously come to mind. There was a 68-yard rainbow to Tyler Lockett in week 1, a beautiful throw from Russell Wilson. Alex Collins weaving like he was in the slalom at the Olympics against the 49ers. I absolutely loved that being a running back guy, but I got to go with the 84-yard touchdown against the Saints for DK Metcalf just because of who he was going up against. He had Marshawn Lattimore, who to me is a top 5 corner in this league, on him in coverage. And they had Marcus Williams, who's played like an all-pro this year at safety. He was over there as well. And all Metcalf did was break through a ankle tackle from Lattimore after he had jumped up, perfectly timed his leap, got the ball down the sideline. And after he broke that first tackle, then he stiff arms Marcus Williams. And then it's funny watching the TV copy because you can just see Marshawn Lattimore. He took like 3 steps and then he's like, okay, he's gone. Just kind of started jogging like, I'm not going to catch DK Metcalf with that track speed that he has at 6'4", 230 pounds. It was the type of play that really showed you everything that DK Metcalf brings to this table that makes him special. And it was from Geno Smith as well. It got the crowd ignited. They unfortunately were not able to win that game. But to me, that was the play that was most spectacular in these first 8 games.
It certainly was a spectacular play. And as you mentioned, Marshawn Lattimore shut it down. And Marshawn Lattimore ran a 4.32. And so that's kind of shocking that he just shut down. It's just an acknowledgement of what a beast that DK Metcalf is, what an incredible talent that he is. I'm also going to go with the DK Metcalf touchdown. I'm going to use this last one against the Jacksonville Jaguars. And maybe that's a little bit of recency bias, but it demonstrated DK Metcalf going up and stealing the football from another very good cornerback, Shaq Griffin. But I also thought that not only DK Metcalf's body control, his physicality, just jumping up and high pointing the football, but an exquisite throw from Geno Smith. And I didn't acknowledge him earlier. I certainly want to do that in this case. There have been so many really good throws from Russell Wilson down the stretch, but one of the things I've not seen consistently enough is accurate back shoulder fades. That was as pretty of a back shoulder fade from Geno Smith as I've seen in all of the NFL, and DK Metcalf, finish the play. And so to me, that has been Seattle's top play. And one of the reasons why I personally do have a great deal of optimism, I do think that the Seahawks are playing pretty good football right now. So I'm curious to see how it's going to go down during the second half of the season.
Thanks for making Locked On Seahawks your first listen every day. Now make your second listen the Peacock and Williamson NFL show. Brian Peacock and former NFL scout Matt Williamson give you the expert NFL analysis in less than 30 minutes. It's free and it's available on all platforms. You can follow me on Twitter at Corbin Smith NFL. You can follow Rob at Rob Rang. Make sure to check out Locked On Seahawks on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and the all-new Odyssey app. That's AUDACY. Coming up on our Wednesday episode, Rob and I are going to be dishing out our midseason awards on the defensive side of the football, Defensive Player of the Year, Most Improved, and a number of other awards. You won't want to miss it. Thanks for listening in. Enjoy the rest of your Tuesday. Go Hawks.